I have cut apart more dead ships than I could name, and I have never once been sorry to do it. A ship that has stopped breathing is just material, plate and frame, and the long bones of a thing that used to carry people somewhere. You learn to see it that way or you don't last in the trade. The men who can't stop hearing the dead in a hull go soft, and the soft ones go broke, and the broke ones end up working someone else's deck for someone else's cut. I had spent 26 years making sure I never heard anything in a wreck but the work waiting in it. The Sundered choir was the kind of job a man like me waits half his life for, and then half hopes never comes, because the size of the payday tells you the size of the trouble that made it. She was an alien hauler, big as a town, drifting dead in the Calder Reach with her drive cold and her running lights long since gone dark. The Reach is a debris field, a slow river of broken ships and shattered ice and the scattered teeth of old collisions, all of it turning under a dim red star that never quite rises and never quite sets. Nobody patrols it. Nobody claims it. Things die in there and the field swallows them, and once in a long while a thing dies that's worth going in after. The choir was worth going in after. Her hull was an alloy I had only ever read about, the kind that holds its temper after a century in the black, the kind the foundries on the inner stations would strip the skin off their own grandmothers to get. One clean cut of her dorsal spine would clear every debt I had and buy me a real berth, a real bed, a window that looked at something other than the inside of my own helmet. I brought my tug in slow, the way you always bring a tug into the Reach, nosing through the slow tumble of dead metal with the running lights down so I wouldn't blind myself on every spinning shard. My boat is called the Good Day. That's not a joke, though men have taken it for one. She was named by the woman I bought her from, a salvager older than I am now, who told me she'd had a good day the day she found her and never bothered to change it after. I never bothered either. The Good Day is small and ugly, and the best thing I have ever owned, and she nestled up against the flank of that great dead hauler like a tick on the side of an ox. I cut my way in through a hull breach near her stern. Whatever had killed the choir had done it from inside, no torpedoes scoring, no railgun craters, just a long internal wound where something had let go and torn its way out through 3 decks of her. That meant she died slow. Drive failure, maybe, or a cascade in her air plant, the kind of dying that takes a crew days and gives them time to understand what's coming. I have been inside enough slow deaths to know the feel of them. The fast ones, the ones blown apart in a breath, those are clean. The slow ones leave the inside of a ship looking like the inside of a story you don't want to finish reading. Doors braced from one side, tools dropped where hands let go of them. The small, frantic geographies of people trying to live a little longer. I told myself none of that mattered, material, plate and frame. For 2 days I worked her without ever going deep. I mapped her with sounding charges and pulled her schematics off a data core that still held charge, and I planned my cuts the way a butcher plans a carcass. The big clean lines first, the spine, the long structural members, the drive housing if I could get to it before the field took the wreck somewhere I couldn't follow. The aliens who'd built her were a species I didn't know, and their ship was built strange to my eye, the corridors too tall and too narrow. The doors irised instead of hinged. The deck a soft dark material that gave a little underfoot like packed moss. Everything in her was scaled for people taller and thinner than me, with hands that wanted finer controls than mine, and there was a smell in her even through my helmet's filters, a dry green smell like an old greenhouse with the heat shut off. On the 3rd day I went deep, because the schematic showed me where her drive coupling was, and there was no cutting the spine without going past the place her people had spent their last days. I found the creche on the way. I didn't know the word for it then. I only knew I'd come down a long companionway into a space that wasn't engineering and wasn't crew quarters, and wasn't anything I recognized. A wide, low chamber ringed with rows of recessed cells, each one no bigger than a coffin and built into the wall like the drawers of a great cold cabinet. Most of them stood open and dark. A few were sealed. And in the floor of that chamber, frozen where they'd settled in the long dying, were the small, still shapes of the ones who hadn't made it to a cell in time, curled the way the young of every species I've ever heard of curl, knees to chest, faces tucked away. I have seen the dead before. I told myself material, and I knew even as I told myself that it was the first time the word had ever failed me. They were children. Whatever else they were that. Small and thin-boned, ash-gray skinned, with long, delicate fingers and the pointed ears their whole species seemed to carry, and they had died down here in the cold while the adults of the choir did whatever adults do at the end. And I will not tell you everything I saw on that deck, because some things are not mine to give away to strangers. I will only tell you that I stood in that chamber a long time with my cutting torch dark in my hand, and that the trade, which had never once asked anything of me but a steady hand, asked me for the first time to keep walking and start cutting, and for the first time I could not make myself do what the trade wanted. That was when I heard it. It was not a sound, not really, not the way sound usually comes to a man in vacuum. It came through the deck and up through the soles of my boots, a small rhythmic thing, faint as a watch ticking in another room. I went still. I thought it was the hull settling, or my own pulse, or the long habit a tired mind has of inventing company. I knelt down. The trade hates that kneeling. It wastes a man's air and slows his work. And I knelt anyway, and I put my gloved hand flat against the soft, dark deck, and I felt it again. Tick, a pause, tick, a pause. It was coming from one of the sealed cells. I want to be honest about what I felt, because a man telling a story like this is always tempted to make himself better than he was. I did not feel a great rush of mercy. What I felt first, God help me, was that I did not want to know. I wanted it to be the hull. I wanted to be a man who cut up dead ships and went home, and I knew that if I opened that cell I would stop being that man. And I have learned since that there are moments where the only honest thing a person can do is admit they wish the door would stay shut, and then open it anyway. I crossed the chamber. The sealed cell was warm. I could feel the warmth of it through my glove before I ever found the catch, a small living heat in all that cold and the readout beside it. I couldn't read their script, but I have spent my life reading dials I don't understand by the color of them. The readout beside it glowed the soft, steady green that every species in the galaxy seems to have agreed means alive, means well, means here. It took me the better part of an hour to work out the seal without killing what was inside. The cell had its own little reservoir of air and heat, a last desperate engineering, a parent species deciding that if nothing else would survive, this one would. This one cell would hold its warmth long after the great ship around it had gone cold and dark and forgotten. I have thought about that a great deal since. Somebody on that dying ship made a choice about which one to seal. I will never know how they chose. I have decided not to imagine it. When the seal finally gave, a breath of warm, green-smelling air sighed out into my helmet sensors, and the cell irised open, and she looked up at me. She was small. Small even for one of them, small enough that I could have carried her in the crook of one arm, and she was thin in the way that frightens you, the way that says she had been living on the cell's thin ration for longer than a cell was ever meant to keep someone. Her skin was the same ash gray as the others but warmer, with a faint blue cast to it where the light caught, and her eyes were enormous and dark and entirely without white, all deep and liquid, and they fixed on me and did not look away. I have been looked at by a great many living things, customers and creditors and the law and the wrong kind of men in the wrong kind of port. I had never been looked at like that, not afraid, though she should have been, not hopeful, though I wish I could tell you she was. She looked at me the way you look at weather, the way you look at a thing that has simply arrived and will do whatever it is going to do, and there is no use in feeling much about it either way. She had, I think, already done all her hopping. She had used it up sealed in that cell waiting for a door to open, and a door had opened, and it was me, and she took that in with the flat, dark calm of someone who has decided to keep breathing for no reason, except that breathing is what she had been doing and she did not know how to stop. "Hey," I said like a fool, into a vacuum she couldn't hear me through. Hey, there you are. She lifted one long-fingered hand and laid it against the inside of her cell's frame, just where my glove rested on the outside, gray fingers spread against my worn black ones with a half-inch of alloy between. And I understood that whatever I had told myself for 26 years about plate and frame, the trade had just ended for me, right there, on a dead deck a long way from any star a man could name. I took her up to the good day. I had to seal her into one of my emergency pressure rolls to do it, a thing like a sleeping bag with its own air, because she couldn't survive the long cold crawl back to my boat otherwise, and she let me. That was the thing I remember most clearly. She let me. A child of a species I'd never met, taken up out of the one warm place left in her whole dead world by a thing twice her size in a faceless helmet. And she went still, and let me work the roll closed around her and lift her against my chest and carry her out, and the trust of it nearly put me on my knees a second time. She had no reason to trust me. She had every reason in the void not to. She did it anyway, the way the young do, betting everything they have left on the chance that the big slow thing that found them means them well. And I swore to myself somewhere in that crawl that I would not be one more thing in this galaxy that took a child's trust and broke it. I got her aboard. I got the pressure roll into my own bunk and got my air up to something a body could breathe and got the heat up past the level I keep it at to save power, and I peeled the roll open, and she came out of it blinking in the dim cabin light of my ugly little boat and looked around at the mess of my life. The tool racks and the ration bins and the photograph of nobody she'd recognized stuck to the bulkhead. And she did not cry, and she did not flinch. She climbed out of the roll on unsteady legs and stood in the middle of my cabin, this small gray impossible thing, and she looked at me, and I crouched down to her level the way you do with anything small and uncertain, slow, hands where she could see them. I didn't have anything she could eat. That was the first true panic of it. I went through my stores in my head and realized I had nothing, that I had no idea what her people lived on, that I could fill her with the wrong thing and that would be that. I have since learned more than I ever wanted to know about the dietary needs of her species, but in that moment I knew nothing, and I did the only thing I could think to do, which was to bring out everything I had, every ration and packet and dried thing in the boat, and lay it out on the deck in front of her and back away, and let her choose. She watched me do it with those flat dark eyes. Then she crawled forward and went through it slowly, sniffing, touching, and she found the one thing in all my stores that her body could take, a brick of pressed protein meant for the cold runs, the blandest thing I own, and she ate a small, careful amount of it and stopped, the way someone who has been hungry a long time knows to stop, and she looked up at me again. I won't pretend the days that followed were tender exactly. They were mostly terror. I'm a man who lives alone in a small boat in a dangerous trade, and I did not know the first thing about keeping a child alive, never mind an alien one, never mind one who'd come out of a cold so long and deep I could see the marks of it on her, the thinness, the way she slept too much and woke too easily. I made every mistake there is to make. I kept the cabin too warm and then too cold. I gave her too much of the protein and made her sick and learned to give her less. I tried to talk to her constantly out of my own nerves and learned slowly that she did better with quiet, that my voice was a thing she came to trust by its steadiness and not its content. The way you gentle a frightened animal, except she was no animal, she was a person, and I knew it more every hour. Because she watched everything. She watched me work and she learned the boat faster than I'd have believed, which way the panels opened, where the warm air came from, which corner of the cabin caught the red star's light when we turned just so. By the third day she had a place she liked, a nook between the air plant and the bulkhead where the warmth pooled, and she would fold herself into it, knees to chest the way I'd seen the others curled on that terrible deck, except she was breathing, and I never once let myself stop being grateful for the difference. On the fourth day she made a sound at me. It was not a word or not one I'd ever know, a soft three-note thing low in her throat, and she made it while pointing one long finger at the protein brick, and I understood she was asking, and I gave it to her, and she made the sound again differently after, and I have always believed that second sound was thanks. I made my own sound back, the only thing I could think of, my own name. Renner, I said, and tapped my chest. Renner. She watched my mouth. She didn't try to copy it, but she pointed at me after that when she wanted me, and I came, and that was a language good enough for both of us. I should have left the reach the day I found her. I know that now. If I had cut and run that first day, gone in with the good days drive hot and the choir behind me and never looked back, the rest of it would not have happened. But I did not, and I will tell you why, and it is not a reason I am proud of. I stayed because the salvage was still there. Because the Sundered choir was still the richest wreck of my life, still drifting fat and intact at the end of my cutting lines. And a part of me, the part the trade had made over 26 years, the part that thinks in plate and frame, that part said, you can do both. You can keep the child and take the spine. A few more days. Get her stable, get her fed, and in the meantime cut the cut that pays for the rest of both your lives. I told myself I was being responsible. I told myself a man with a child to keep needs money more than a man alone, not less. And both of those things were true, and they were also the thing that nearly cost me everything, because the days I spent reaching for that payday were the days the beacon had to work. I found the beacon on the 5th day, and I found it by accident, going back into the choir to scout my spine cut, and the only mercy in it is that I found it at all. It was wired into the creche. I should have understood it sooner. The sealed cell had its own systems, its own little brain keeping its occupant alive, and that brain was not silent. It had been calling. Quietly, patiently, on a frequency I didn't monitor because nothing in my trade ever transmits on it. The cell had been broadcasting since the day the choir died, a slow, steady ping that said, in whatever language the machines of her people spoke, here, alive, here, come, recoverable. It was a thing built to summon rescue. It had no way of knowing rescue would never come from her own people. It had no way of knowing who would hear it instead. I knelt in the cold creche with my hand on that little machine, and I listened to the thing it had been saying for years into the dark, and a cold went through me that had nothing to do with the temperature, because I knew the reach. I knew who works the edges of a debris field. I knew that a beacon broadcasting recoverable for years across the Calder reach would not have gone unheard, and that whoever had heard it would not be coming for the reasons that beacon was built for. I was right. I had 3 days. I didn't know it was 3 days at the time. I only knew, kneeling there, that the warm calm I'd let myself sink into aboard the good day, the small false piece of a man and a child and a wreck full of money, was over, and that I had stayed too long. The ledger came on the 8th day. I want to explain about the ledger, because if you have not lived out past the patrolled lanes you may not understand what they are, and they matter to the rest of this. The ledger is not a government and not a crew of common pirates. It would be easier if it were. The ledger is a guild, an old one with charters and offices and a system of law that is entirely its own and entirely real out past the edge of anyone else's. It recovers things. Debts mostly. And the collateral against debts, and the collateral has no special definition out there. A ship can be collateral. A cargo can be collateral. A person can be collateral if a contract somewhere says they are, and the ledger does not ask whether the contract was just. The ledger only asks whether it is valid, and it is very, very good at making contracts valid, and out past the patrols there is no one to tell it no. They are not cruel for the joy of it. That is the part that's hard to make people understand. They are worse than cruel. They are correct. They will do a terrible thing to you and show you the paperwork that makes it lawful, and they will be genuinely puzzled at your objection, because in their world the paperwork is the only thing that has ever been real. The Sundered choir, it turned out, had owed the ledger a debt. I pieced this together later from what their factor told me and what I dragged out of the choir's own records once I knew to look. Her people had borrowed against her hull and her cargo and in the fine print of an old desperate contract, against the unsecured value of her passengers and crew, which is to say the people, which is to say everyone aboard her, which is to say the children in that creche. When the choir died, the debt did not. Debts do not die when ships do. The debt sat on the ledger's books for years, accruing, and the beacon in the creche broadcast recoverable into the dark, and somewhere in a ledger office, a factor's eye eventually fell on a line in a column, and saw that one item of collateral on a long-dead account was, against all odds, still live, still recoverable, and the ledger, which leaves nothing on its books unrecovered, sent someone to collect. His ship slid out of the debris field with no running lights and no hail, the way they do, the way a thing comes when it does not believe you have any right to be warned. It was a long, lean vessel, gray as ash, built for boarding with the ledger's mark on its flank, a single closed circle, which is their sign, the closed account, the thing that balances. It matched my drift and held off the choir at a careful distance, and only when it was good and sure of its position did it deign to hail me. The factor's name was Os. I will give him that much, his name, and the fact that he was, by his own lights, an honest creature. He came across to the Good Day in a boarding shell with 2 of his crew, and I let them, because a man alone in a small boat does not refuse a ledger boarding shell, not if he wants the boat to stay whole around him. They came into my cabin, tall and gray and thin, the same long-fingered build as the child but grown and hard, and dressed in the matte gray weave the ledger wears. And the child went into her nook between the air plant and the bulkhead and folded herself small, and Os looked at her there with no more feeling than I'd look at a crate. "You found our property," he said. His common tongue was flat and perfect, the way it is when a thing has learned a language purely to do business in it. "We are grateful. Recovery in the Reach is difficult. We will of course honor the standard finder's portion. You have done the ledger a service." I've replayed that moment more times than I can count, and what I keep coming back to is how reasonable he was. He was not threatening me. He thought he was paying me. In his world I had stumbled across a piece of lost collateral and kept it warm, and the natural and lawful thing was for him to take it and for me to be compensated for my trouble, and he was, by the standards of the ledger, being generous. He had a pad in his hand already, ready to credit my account. He expected me to be pleased. "She's not property," I said. I said it quietly. I have learned over a life that the quiet things land harder than the loud ones, with the right kind of man, and I was hoping Os was the right kind of man. He was not, but I didn't know that yet. Os looked at me with what I came to recognize as his version of patience. "She is collateral against account 4471 Vale in default for 11 standard years. I have the instrument here. I can show you the relevant clauses." He actually started to. He turned the pad toward me, and there on its screen was a document, dense with their script and helpfully annotated in common where it touched the points that mattered, and one of those points, plain as anything, marked and tagged and lawful, was her. A line, an item, a figure with her against it. "I can read what it says," I said. "I'm telling you what's true. She's not property. She's a child. You don't put a debt on a child." "Her parent line did," Os said. 11 years ago, willingly against need. It is not the ledger's practice to forgive a debt because the debtors are no longer present to honor it. The collateral remains. That is the entire principle of collateral. If it could be made to disappear by the absence of the debtor, it would secure nothing. He said it the way you'd explain water to a man who claimed not to believe in it. He was not angry. He was correcting an error. "I understand," he went on, and here his voice did something I have never forgotten. It softened, it tried to be kind, which was the worst thing it could have done. "I understand that you have kept her some days and that this creates a sentiment. I have seen it before. It passes. She is not of your species. She will be returned to a holding appropriate to her account and disposed of according to its terms. You need not concern yourself with what follows. Take the finder's portion. It is fair. It is more than fair. Disposed of according to its terms." I asked him what the terms were. I made myself ask in that quiet voice, with the child folded small in her nook a body length away, and Os told me because he had no reason not to, because to him it was simply the answer to a question. The account was old and the collateral was minor, and the cost of holding a live miner of a non-trading species against a dead account exceeded any value she could be sold into. The ledger did not keep what it could not turn. She would be entered into the recovery ledger. The account would be marked recovered and closed, and the collateral would be liquidated, which in their flat correct language meant exactly what it sounds like, and I will not write it more plainly than that, because she was sitting right there, and because some things should not be written plainly even years after, and because I have decided that the worst of what the ledger intended is the ledger's to carry and not mine to pass on to you. He showed me the paperwork for that too. That is the thing I cannot forget. He had the paperwork for it. It was all in order. I have been afraid in my life. Real fear, the kind that empties your hands. But what came over me in that cabin was not fear. It was a cold and total quiet, the quiet I imagine settles on a man right before he does the thing his whole life turns out to have been pointing at. And through that quiet I looked at Os and his 2 crewmen and his perfect lawful pad, and I understood 3 things all at once. The first was that there was no argument I could make. I am not a clever man, and I have never won by words, but even a clever man wins nothing against the ledger by words, because the ledger has already had every argument and written the losing ones into its charter. There was no thing I could say that Os had not heard and ruled on 100 years before I was born. The second was that I could not fight them, not the way fighting means. 3 grown ledger men in my cabin with a boarding ship and a crew across the gap, against 1 tired salvage hand with a cutting torch. That is not a fight. That is a way of dying badly and leaving her with no one. The trade does not teach you to fight. It teaches you the opposite. It teaches you to never be in a fight, to read a situation and find the cut that makes the fight unnecessary. And the third thing, the thing that turned the quiet in me to iron, was that I knew the Sundered choir better than they did. I had spent 8 days inside that dead ship. I had mapped her with sounding charges and read her schematics and walked her corridors and learned the long internal wound that had killed her, the cascade that had torn out through 3 decks. I knew where she was strong and where she was a held breath away from letting go. I knew her drift, the slow tumble the reach had her in, the way she'd swing if you hit her structure wrong. The ledger men knew none of that. To them she was a line item, an asset to be logged and stripped at leisure once the live collateral was secured. They had not gone deep. Why would they? They had come for the child. The ship would keep. I said, "Let me get her ready." Os inclined his head, satisfied, a transaction proceeding to its natural close. Of course, there is no need for distress. It is best done calmly. He even believed that. He thought he was sparing her. We will wait aboard, bring her across when she is settled. We are not in a hurry. That last part was true, and it was the only piece of luck I had. They were not in a hurry. The ledger is never in a hurry. Time is on their side. It is the whole engine of what they do. They went back across to their lean gray ship to log the recovery and prepare a holding for her, and they left me my cabin and my child in a window of hours, and they did not for 1 second imagine that a man would do anything with those hours but exactly as he'd been told. Why would he? The paperwork was in order. He'd been offered a fair portion. To refuse was not a thing that happened in their world. Refusal to the ledger is just a delay before compliance. They have never met the other thing. I am going to tell you what I did, but first I have to tell you the part that matters more, which is what I did with the first of those hours before I touched a single tool. I sat down on the deck of my cabin, slow, hands where she could see them, and I looked at her in her nook, and she looked back at me with those flat, dark eyes that had done all their hopping years ago, and I understood that she had heard all of it. Not the words, but the shape of it. The way Os had looked at her like a crate. The way the cold quiet had come into the cabin and settled. Children know. Whatever else they don't understand, they always know when the adults around them have started deciding things, and she had folded herself small and gone still and was waiting, the way she'd waited in that cell, for a door to open and to find out which kind of thing was on the other side of it this time. I did not have words she'd understand. So I gave her the only thing I had that I knew she'd read. I put out my hand, palm up, on the deck between us, the way I had a dozen times in those 8 days, and I held it there steady, and I waited. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she unfolded from her nook and crossed the small cabin and put her long gray fingers in my palm, the way she had against the wall of her cell with the alloy between us, except there was nothing between us now, and her hand was warm, warmer than mine, that small living heat I'd first felt through a glove on a dead deck, and I closed my fingers around it gentle, and I made her a promise she could not understand in any language but that one. Not you, the promise said, whatever else, not you. Then I let go of her hand and I went to work, because a promise without the work behind it is just a sound a man makes to feel better, and I have never had much use for those. Here is what I knew that they did not. The Sundered choir's internal wound, the cascade that had killed her, had left her dorsal spine carrying loads it was never built to carry. She was holding herself together by habit and the cold patience of metal, but she was holding a tension, an enormous slow strain along her broken back, and I had planned to release that strain carefully, cut by careful cut, the way you fell a leaning tree, exactly so it would not whip and kill you when it went. I had the cutting lines already rigged for that careful felling, run from the good day along the choir's spine, the charges placed, the sequence timed, all of it set up to take her apart gently over a day of patient work. I had set it up to be gentle. It is not hard, when a man knows a thing that well, to set it up to be the opposite. I worked through the rest of that window with my hands steady and my mind clear, and I did 3 things. I moved the good day. Quietly, on cold thrusters, a slow drift, putting the bulk of the dead choir between my boat and the ledger ship, so that when it began I would have the wreck for cover and a clear run out into the deep field where the debris was thickest, and a lean boarding-built ship would not dare follow a salvage tug that knew the rocks. I re-rigged the cutting lines, not to fell the spine gently, to release it all at once, on the side away from me, in a sequence that would whip that enormous stored tension out and around like a struck whip, throwing the wreck's whole tumbling mass in a way the field would amplify, a way that would send a cascade of debris and torn structure across the gap, toward the place the ledger ship sat patient and certain. And I left a beacon of my own. This was the part Os would never have understood, and it is the part I am in truth most at peace with. Before I cut, I broadcast openly on the common bands loud, the way nothing in my trade ever broadcasts, a salvage claim. A formal one logged with timestamp and position, claiming the Sundered choir, her hull and frame and every line item aboard her, as recovered salvage under common law, witnessed by the void itself. It would mean nothing to the ledger. Their law is not common law, and they answer to no one out there. But the ledger keeps books, and a book is a fragile thing, and I wanted it written somewhere, written loud, written where the inner stations and their patrols and their courts could one day find it, that on this day a man had stood in the Calder Reach and claimed everything aboard that wreck, and that the only thing he carried off of her was a child, and that he had named her in his claim, not as collateral and not as property and not as a line item, but as a survivor, a rescued person. Mine to carry, theirs to leave alone. I do not know if anyone will ever read it. I sent it anyway. Some things you write down so the universe can't pretend it didn't happen. Then I sealed the child into the pressure roll again, and I held her against my chest the way I had carrying her out of the dead, and I felt the small fast tick of her breathing through the roll against my ribs, and I went to my board, and I cut the Sundered choir loose. It was not a fight. I want to be clear about that because men hear a story like this and want it to be a fight, want the salvage hand to have blasted the ledger ship out of the black, and that is not what happened and not what I am. There were no weapons. There was only knowing the wreck. The charges went in the sequence I'd set, away from me, along the broken spine, and that enormous patient tension that the dead ship had been holding for 11 years let go all at once. The choir did not explode. That is too clean a word. She came apart the way a thing comes apart when it has been waiting a long time to. The great dorsal members whipping out and around as the strain released, the whole vast tumbling mass of her lurching in the field, and the debris of her, torn plate, snapped frame, a century of dead alloy flung out across the gap in a slow expanding wall, exactly toward the place where a lean gray ship sat certain and patient and entirely unprepared. Because nothing in 11 years of recovery had ever taught the ledger that a man might rather wreck a fortune than hand over a child. I did not stay to watch it land. The good day was already moving, already running on the far side of the dying wreck, out into the thick of the field where I knew the rocks and they did not. I heard Os on the common band once, his flat, perfect voice gone strange with something that was not quite anger and not quite understanding. I think it was the closest the ledger comes to grief, the sound of a creature watching an account it had ruled closed tear itself violently back open. He was demanding I cease. He was citing clauses. He was, even then, even with a wall of dead alloy coming across the gap at his hull, telling me what was lawful. I did not answer him. There was no thing to say that he had not already ruled on. I ran the good day out through the debris field on cold thrust and dead reckoning, and the long animal knowledge of a man who has spent his life in places that want to kill him, and the field closed up behind me the way it closes behind everything, slow and dark and indifferent, and the lean gray ship, damaged, I think, though I never knew how badly, slowed at the least, snarled in the wreckage of its own certainty, did not follow. A boarding ship is not built for the deep field. A salvage tug is built for nothing else. By the time the reach thinned out into open black, I was alone again, the way I had been my whole life, except I was not alone, because in the bunk behind me a pressure roll was breathing, small and fast and alive. I did not stop until the red star was a long way behind us, and the reach was gone off my screens, and there was nothing around the good day but clean, empty dark. Then I shut down everything but life support, and I went back into the cabin and I opened the roll. She came out of it the way she'd come out of the cell, blinking, unsteady, looking around at the mess of my life. The protein bricks were spilled across the deck where the cut had thrown them. The photograph of nobody she'd recognize had come loose from the bulkhead. Everything I owned was in disarray, and most of what I'd come to that wreck to gain was gone, scattered across the reach with the bones of the Sundered choir. The richest payday of my life turned to flung debris because I had needed it to be a wall instead of a fortune. I was poorer, leaving the reach, than I had been going in. I had spent 26 years and every credit of leverage I had to walk out with nothing. She crossed the cabin to me. She had learned that in 8 days that when the bad quiet had passed she could come to me. She stood in front of where I sat slumped against the bulkhead, this small, gray, impossible survivor, and she looked at me with those flat, dark eyes, and then she did a thing she had never done before. She made the second sound, the one I had decided years before was thanks, except she had never made it without a reason, without the protein brick, without something given. She made it now with nothing in her hands. She made it just at me. And then she folded herself down beside me, knees to chest, and she leaned the small, warm weight of her against my side, and she breathed, and I sat there in the wreck of my own livelihood with a child I could not understand pressed warm against my ribs, and I have never in my life been richer. I have made a kind of peace in the years since with not knowing how it ends. She is still with me, that much I will tell you. She is not small the way she was, and she has words now, more of mine than I have of hers, and she has never once asked me about the reach, and I have never once told her, and one day I will because she has a right to it, and on that day I will tell her the truth, which is that I did not save her out of any great goodness. I told you at the start I would be honest. I stayed too long for a payday. I almost handed her over for a fair portion. I am not a good man dressed up as a salvage hand. I am just a man who reached a thing he could not do, and found out late in life that there was a line in him after all, drawn in a place he'd never had cause to look, and that the line was this: you do not put a debt on a child, and you do not, when you have heard her breathing, hand her to the ones who would. The ledger keeps its books. Somewhere on a gray page, Account 4471 Vale is marked open again, in default, a balance no one will ever collect, because the only collateral against it is asleep right now in the warm corner of an ugly little boat with her knees to her chest, breathing. And the man who carried her off does not recognize the debt and never will, and there is not paperwork enough in the void to make him. I have cut apart more dead ships than I could name, and I was never once sorry to do it. The Sundered choir was the last. I do not cut wrecks anymore. I cannot hear a hull now without listening for the small thing under the floor, the tick, the pause, the tick. The sound of the one the cold didn't get, the one still waiting for a door to open and find out which kind of thing is on the other side. I hope it's a man like the one I almost wasn't. I hope he opens the door anyway.